Last Dog by Catherine Patterson.
Brock approached the custom gate. Although he did not reach for the scanner, the feeling that it might have labeled excitement made him tremble. His fingers shook as he punched in his number on the inquiry board. "This is highly irregular, Brock 0956700038. The disembodied voice said. "What is your reason for external travel?" Brock took a deep breath. "Scientific research." He implied he didn't need to be told his behavior was irregular. He never heard of anyone doing research outside the dome. Actually, rather than virtual research, I've been clearing my podmaster and the research team. Estimated time of return, so he wasn't to be questioned further, 18 hours.
Are you wearing the prescribed dry suit with helmet and gloves? Affirmative.
You should be equipped with 750 milliliters of liquid and food tablets for one-day travel. Affirmative. Brock patted the sides of the dry suit to be sure.
Remember to drink sparingly. The water supply is limited. Brock nodded. He tried to lick his parched lips, but his whole mouth felt dry. Is that understood? Affirmative. Was he hoping customs would stop him? If he was, they didn't seem to be helping him. Well, this was what he wanted, wasn't it? To go outside the dome.
Turn on the universal locator, Brock 0956700038, and proceed to the gate. Why weren't they questioning him any further? Were they eager for him to go? Ever since he had said out loud in a group speak that he wanted to go outside the dome, people had treated him strangely. That session with the podmaster and the interview with the representative from research. Did they think he was a deviant? Deviants sometimes disappeared. The word was passed around that they had gone outside, but no one really knew. No deviant had ever returned.
The gate slid open before he quite ready for it. Brock found himself outside the protection from the dome. He blinked.
The sun, at least it was what was called the sun in virtual lessons, was too bright for his eyes even inside the tinted helmet. He took a deep breath, one last backward look at the dome, which, with alien sun gleaming on it, was even harder to look at with the distant star, and started across an expanse of brown soil. Was it, to what he recognized from the holograms, the line of purplish mountains in the distance?
It was. He pulled the scanner from his outside pouch and checked it. Hot. Oh, that was what he was feeling, hot. He remembered hot from a virtual lesson he had once on desserts. He wanted to take off the dry suit, but he had been told since he could remember the naked skin would suffer irreparable burning outside the protection of the dome. He adjusted the control as he walked so that the unfamiliar precipitation would evaporate. He fumbled a bit before he found the temperature adjustment function. He put it on 20 degrees centigrade and immediately felt more comfortable. Now, no one he really knew had ever left the dome. But there was all this equipment in case someone decided to venture out. He tried to ask the clerk who outfitted him, but the woman was evasive. The equipment was old, she said. People used to go out, but the outside environment was threatening. So hardly anyone ever used it now.
Was Brock, then, the only normal person still curious about the outside? Or had all those who had dared to venture out perished, discouraging further forays? Perhaps he was a deviant for wanting to see the mountains for himself. When he'd mentioned it to others, they had laughed, but there was a hollow sound to the laughter.
If he never returned, he had no one to blame but himself. He knew that. While his pod fellows played virtual games, he wandered into a subsection of historical virtuals called ancient fictions. Things happened in these fictions more
well more densely than they did. In the virtuals, the plane he met there, it was hard to describe, but somehow they were more actual than dome dwellers. They had strange names like Huck Finn and MC Higgins, the Great Four. They were even a little scary. It was in their insides. Their insides were very louder, but even though the people in the ancient fictions frightened him a bit, he couldn't get enough of them. When no one was paying attention, he went back again and again to visit them. They had made him wonder about that other world, that world outside the dome.
Perhaps once he has realized the danger of the ancient fictions posed, he should have left them alone, but he couldn't help himself. They had made him feel hollow, hungry for something no food pellet or even virtual experience could satisfy. And now he was in that world. They spoke of the mountains of it were in plain view.
He headed for the purple curves. Within a short distance from the dome, the land was clear and barren. But after he had been walking of what might have been the dwellings of ancient peoples, and no one in later years had cleared away for recycling or vaporization, he checked the emotional scanner for an unfamiliar sensation. Loneliness, it registered. He rather liked having names for these new sensations. It had made him feel a bit proud, was it? The scanner was rather interesting. He wondered when people stopped using them. He hadn't known they existed until in that pod meeting. He had his voice desire to go outside.
The podmaster had looked at him with a raised eyebrow and a sniff. Next thing you'll be asked for a scanner, he said. What's a scanner? Brock asked.
The podmaster requisitioned one from storage, but at the same time, he must have alerted research because it was the representative from research who had brought him to the scanner and questioned him about his expressed desire for an actual adventure, a journey outside the dome. What has promoted this, huh? Unusual ambition? The representative had asked, his eyes not on Brock, but on the scanner in his hand. Brock had hesitated, distracted by the man's fidgeting with the strange instrument. I'm interested in scientific research, Brock said at last.
So here he was out of the pod alone for the first time in his life. Perhaps, though, he should have asked one of his pod fellows to come along, or even the pod robot pet. But the other fellows all laughed when he spoke of going outside, their eyes darting back and forth. Nothing on the outside, they said, could equal the New West virtual adventure. He suddenly realized that ever since he started interfacing with the ancient fiction, his fellows had given him the look. They didn't think he was odd, not quite the same as a regular pod fellow. Brock didn't really divide with the pod robot.
It was one of the more modern ones, and they've programmed it, artificial intelligence. They somehow made it too smart. The RoboPet in the children's pool last year was older, stupider, and more fun to have around.
Hearthgap.
He badly underestimated the distance to the mountains. The time was well past noon, and he had at least 3 kilometers to go. Should he signal late return or turn about now? He didn't have much more than 1 day's scant supply of water and food tablets, but he was closer to the hills than to the dome. He felt a thrill and pressed on.
There were actual trees growing on the first hill, not the great giants of virtual history lessons, more scrubby and bent, but there were trees. He was sure of it. The podmaster had said the trees had been extinct for hundreds of years. Brock reached up and pulled off a leaf. It was green and had vines. In some ways it looked like his own land. He put the leaf in his pack to study later. He didn't want anyone accusing him of losing his scientific objectivity. Only
Deviants.
Only deviants did that. Farther up the hill, he heard an unfamiliar burbling sound. No, he knew that sound. It was water running. He'd heard it once when the liquid dispenser had malfunctioned. There been a near
There was no caution signal, so he hurried toward the sound. It was a brook. He was sure of it. Virtual lessons had taught him that there was such things outside in the past, but that they had long ago grown poisonous, then in the warming climate had dried up. But here was a running brook, not even a 4-hour journey from his dome. His first impulse was to take off his protective glove and dip a finger in it, but he drew back. He had well conditioned to avoid danger. He sat down clumsily on the bank. Yes, this must be grass. There were even some tiny flowers mixed in the grass. Would the atmosphere poison him if he unscrewed his helmet to take a sniff? He punched the scanner to read conditions, but the characters on the scanner panel danced about uncertainly until, at length, the disembodied voice said, "Conditions unreadable. He'd better not risk it."
He pushed the buttons now for liquid and pellets. A tube appeared in his mouth. It dropped a pellet on his tongue. From the tube he sucked liquid enough to swallow his meal. What was it called outside? Nourishment in the history virtuals? Picnic? Something like that. He was having a picnic in the woods by a brook. A nasty consulting of the scanner revealed that what he was feeling was pleasure. He was very glad he hadn't come with an anxious podfellow, or worse, an advanced robo-pet that would no doubt be yanking at his suit already, urging him back towards the dome.
It was then, in the middle of post-picnic satisfaction, that he heard the new sound, like that programmed into a robo-pet, yet different. He struggled to his feet. The dry suit from storage was certainly awkward when he wanted to stand up or sit down. Nothing on the scanner indicated danger, so he went into the scrubby woods toward the sound and stopped abruptly.
Something was lying under the shadow of a tree, something about a meter long. It was furred and quite still. The sound was not coming from it. And then he saw the small dog, the puppy. He was sure it was a puppy, nosing the stiff body of what must once have been its mother, making the little crying sounds that he'd heard from the brook. Later, much later, he realized that he should have been wary. If the older dog had died of extradomal disease, the puppy might have been a carrier. But at the time, all he could think of was the puppy and a small creature who had lost its mother.
He'd found out about mothers from virtuals. Mothers were extinct in the dome. Children were conceived and born in the lab and raised in units of 12 in the pods, presided over by a bank of computers and the podmaster. Nuclear families, as everyone knew, had been wasteful of time, energy, and space. There was an old proverb, the key to survival is So though Brock could guess, the puppy was sad, like that fiction's person, Joe, whose podmate expired. He didn't know what missing mother would
feel like, and who would whimper for a test tube.
Brock had never seen a dog, of course, but he'd seen plenty of dog breeds descriptions on the science history virtuals. Dogs had been abundant once. They filled the ancient fictions. They even had names like Lassie, Toto, Sounder. But now dogs were extinct, gone during the Dark Ages.
Gone during the Dark Ages, when the atmosphere had become warm and poisonous, the savages, who had not had the intelligence or wealth to join the four-sided dome crafters, had killed all animals, wild or domesticated, for food because they had eventually died out themselves. It was all in one of the first virtual lessons. He had seen that one many times. He never confessed to anyone how sad it made him feel. But obviously dogs were not quite extinct. Cautiously he moved towards the small one. Alert, alert, scanning unknown object. Brock pushed the button off. Are you sure you want to turn off scanner? Affirmative. He stuck the scanner into his pouch. The puppy had lifted its head at the sound of his voice. It looked at him, head cocked, as though deciding whether to run or stay.
It's all right, dog, Brock said soothingly. I won't hurt you. He stayed still. He didn't want to frighten the little beast. If it ran, he wasn't sure he'd be able to catch it in his clumsy dry suit. Slowly he extended his gloved hand. The dog backed away anxiously, but when Brock kept the hand extended, the puppy slowly crept toward him and sniffed, making whimpering sounds. It wasn't old enough to be truly afraid, it seemed. The puppy licked his glove tentatively, then backed away again. It was looking for food, and plasticine gloves weren't going to satisfy it. Brock looked first at the dead mother, whose source of nourishment must have long dried up, then around the landscape. What would a dog eat? A puppy on its own. He took off his glove and reached through his pouch into the inside pocket that held his pellet supply. Making every move slow and deliberate so as not to startle the dog, he held out a pellet. The dog came to his hand, licked it, then the pellet. It wrinkled its nose. Brock laughed. He didn't need the scanner now to tell him that what he felt was pleasure. He loved the feeling of the rough tongue on his palm and the little furred face questioning him.
It's all right, fellow. You can eat it. As though understanding, the pup gulped down the pellet, then looked around for more, not realizing that it just bolted down in a whole meal. When the dog saw there was no more coming, it ran over to the brook. Brock watched in horror as it put its head right down to the poisonous stream and lapped noisily. Don't, Brock cried. The puppy turned momentarily at the sound, and then went back to drinking, as though it was the most normal thing in the world. Well, it was for the dog. Where else would a creature in the wild get liquid? If the streams were not all dried up, they must have learned to tolerate the water. But then, it was breathing the poisoned atmosphere, wasn't it?
Why hadn't it hit Brock before? This was a fully organic creature on the outside, without any life support system. What could that mean? Some amazing mutation must have occurred, making it possible for at least some creatures to breathe the outside atmosphere and drink its poisoned water. Those who couldn't died, those who could survive and got stronger. Even the ancient scientist Darwin knew that. And Brock had come upon one of these magnificent mutants. The puppy whimpered and looked up at Brock with large, trusting eyes. How could he think of it as a mutant specimen? It was a puppy, one who had lost its mother. What would it eat? There was no sign of food for a carnivore. Perhaps way back in the mountains some small mammals had also survived, keeping the food chain going, but the puppy would not live long enough to find its way there, much less know how to hunt with its mother gone. For the first time in his life, something deep inside Brock reached out toward another creature. The thought of the puppy languishing here by the side of its dead parent until it too.
Your name is Brock, all right? The ancient astronomers had named stars after themselves. He had discovered something just as wonderful. Didn't he have the right to name it sort of after himself while preserving the puppy's uniqueness? Don't worry, Brock. I won't let you starve. Which is why Brock appeared at the customs portal after dark, the front of his dry suit stained, carrying a wriggling canis familiaris, of uncertain breed. If there had been any way to smuggle the dog in, Brock would have, but he couldn't for the life of him figure out how. As it was, every alarm in the area went off when he stepped into the transitional cubicle. In the disembodied voice of the monitor queried him, "Welcome back, Brock. 0956700038. You're late." "Affirmative. And you are carrying contraband." "I pulled a leaf." "Deposit same in quarantine bins." "Affirmative." "Sensors denote warm-blooded presence not on official roster." Sorry. "I found a dog," Brock mumbled.
Repeat. A dog. Canis familiaris is extinct. Well, maybe. It's just a robo-pet that got out somehow. Correction. Robo-pets are bloodless. Leave dry suit for sterilization and proceed to quarantine inspection. The officials in quarantine inspection, who rarely had anything to inspect, were at first nervous, and then, as they watched the puppy happily licking Brock's face, interested, despite themselves. An actual dog. None of them had ever seen one, of course, and Brock's dog was so much, well, more vital than a robo-pet. And although, on later reflection, they knew they should have terminated or expelled it, they couldn't quite bring themselves to do so that night. "It will have to go to research," the chief inspector finally declared. Permission requested to hand carry the dog, known as Brog, to research, Brock said. There was a bit of an argument about that. Several inspectors sought the honor, but the chief declared that Brock, having shed his dry suit and being already contaminated, should be replaced with the dog in a hermetically sealed air car and transported to research. The scientists in research were predictably amazed to see a live Canis familiaris, but being scientists and more objective than the lower grade quarantine inspectors, they kept a safe distance both physically and psychically from the creature. Only the oldest scientist, dressed in proper protective clothing, came into the laboratory with Brock and the dog.
He scanned and poked and prodded the poor little fellow until it began to whimper in protest. "Brog needs to rest," said Brock, interrupting the scientist in the midst of his inspection. "She's had a hard day, and if there's some actual food available, she's not used to pellets." Of course," said one of the researchers through the speaker in the observation booth. "How thoughtless. Send someone out for a McLike burger without sauce. She may regard it as meat. Anyhow, it will seem more like food to her than a pellet." "Affirmative, Brock?" The scientists, Brock soon realized, were looking to him for advice. He was, after all, the discoverer of the last dog. It gave him a sudden scientific status. Brock had sense enough to take advantage of this. After Brock had swallowed the McLike burger in 3 quick gulps, Brock insisted he be allowed to stay with Brog so that he might interact and sleep with her. "She's not like us," he explained. "She's used to tumbling about and curling up with other warm bodies. It's in the old myths," he added. "Puppies separated from their litters cried all night long. She will need constant interaction with another warm-blooded creature, or she might, well, die of," he loved using his new vocabulary, "loneliness."
The scientists agreed. After all, research was rather like quarantine, and since Brock had touched the dog ungloved and unprotected, he might, well, have picked up some germ from her. It was better to keep them both isolated in the research lab, where proper precautions would be taken. For nearly a week, Brock lived with Brog in the research center, eating McLike burgers, playing fetch, teaching Brog to sit, heel, come, all commands he could cull from the ancient texts. The dog quickly learned to obey Brock's commands, but it wasn't the automatic response of a robo-pet. Brog delighted in obedience. She wanted to please Brock, and those few times when she was too busy, nosing about the lab and failed to obey instantly. Those times when Brock's voice took on a sharp tone of reproof, the poor little thing put her tail between her legs, looked up at him with sorrowful eyes, begging to be forgiven. Brock was tempted to speak sharply to her, even when there was no need, for the sight of her drooping ears and tail, her mournful eyes, was so dear to him that he did what Travis Coates had done to Old Yeller. He hugged her. There was no way to explain it. He simply put his arms around her and held her to his chest while she beat at him with her tail and licked his face raw. Out of the corner of his eye, he was aware that one of the scientists was watching. Well, let him watch. Nothing was as wonderful as feeling this warmth towards another creature.
For the first week, the researchers seemed quite content to observe Dog and Boy from the glass-paneled observation booth and speak copious notes into their computers. Only the oldest of them would come into the lab and actually touch the alien creature, and he always wore a sterile protective suit with gloves. The other claimed it would interfere with objectivity if they got close to the dog, but they all seemed to behave positively towards Brog. No mention was made to Brog of his own less than objective behavior. So Brock was astounded to awake in the middle of the night to the sounds of an argument. Someone had forgotten to turn off the communication system. Cloning, it's the only thing to do. If she was the last, we ought to posterity to keep the line going. And how are we going to raise a pack of dogs in a dome? One is nearly eating and drinking us out of test tube and petri dish. We can go on this way. As drastic as it may seem, we have to be realistic. Besides, no one has had the chance to do actual experiments since the Dark Ages. Haven't you ever just once yearned to compare virtual research with actual? What about the boy? He won't agree. Interfacing daily with the dog has become crippled by primal urges.
Can you think what chaos might ensue if a flood or primordial emotions were to surface in a controlled environment such as ours? Another asked. Apparently emotions are easily triggered by interactions with primitive beasts like dogs. Shh, not now. The system clicked off, but Brock had already heard. He knew he had lost everything resembling scientific objectivity. He was no longer sure objectivity was a desirable trait. He rather enjoyed being flooded by primordial emotions, but he was more worried for Brog than for himself. It wasn't hard to figure out what the scientists meant by actual experiments. Cloning would be bad enough. 10 dogs who looked just like Brog, so no one would know how special, how truly unique Brog was. But experiments, they'd cut her open and examine her internal organs, the way scientists had in the Dark Ages. They'd prod her with electric impulses and put chips in her brain. They'd try to change her personality or modify her behavior. They'd certainly try to make her eat and drink less. In the dark, he put his arm around Brog and drew her close. He loved the terrible smell of her breath and the way she snored when she slept. They'd probably fix that too. The next day he played sick. Brog, faithful dog that she was, hung around to him, whimpering, licking his face.
The scientists showed no particular concern. They were too busy plotting what they might do with Brog. Brog crept to the nearest terminal in the lab. It was already logged in. The scientists had been doing nothing but research on Canis familiaris, common canine diseases. Brog scrolled down the list with descriptions. No distemper wouldn't do. The first system was loss of appetite. He couldn't make Brog fake that. On and on it went. No, heartworms wouldn't do. What he needed was a disease that might affect Homo sapiens, as well as Canis familiaris. Here it was. Rabies, a viral disease occurring in animals and humans, especially in dogs and wolves, transmitted by bite or scratch. The early stages of the disease are most dangerous, for an otherwise healthy and friendly appearing animal will suddenly bite without provocation.
Rabies, was it? Somehow he would have to make Brog bite him. There was no anti-rabies serum in the dome, he felt sure. There were no animals in the dome. Why would they use precious space to store an unneeded medication? so they'd have to expel him as well as Brog for fear of spread of diseases. He shivered, then shook himself. No matter what lay on the outside, he could not stand to go back to the life he had lived in the dome before he met Brog. He crept back to bed, pulling the covers over Brog. When one of the scientists came into the observation booth, Brog pinched Brog's neck as hard as he could. Nothing. He pinched again, harder. Brog just snuggled closer, slobbering on his arm. Disgusted, Brog got out of bed. Brog hopped down as well, rubbing against his leg. Pinching obviously was not going to do it. While the scientist on duty in the booth was bending over a computer terminal, Brog brought his foot down onto Brog's paw. A tiny yip was all he got from the cruel effort. Not enough sound to even make the man look up. Feeling better, Brock 095670038, the oldest researcher, had come into the lab.
Affirmative, Brock answered. And how are you, puppy wuppy? The old man tickled Brog under her chin with his gloved hand. If I were a dog, I'd bite someone like that, thought Brock, but Brog, of course, simply licked the researcher's glove and wagged her tail. That was when he got his great idea. He waited to execute it until the proper moment. For the first time, all the scientists had gathered in the lab, all of them in protective garb, some of them twitching nervously in their chairs. They were sitting in a circle around Brock and Brog, explaining what must be done.
It has to be done for the sake of science, they began. Then they went on to for the sake of the dome community, which is always, as you well know, short on food, and particularly short on water. Brock listened to their arguments, nodding solemnly, pretending to agree. It won't be as if she'll be gone. You know, we've made virtuals of her, a special series just for you to keep. You can virtually play with her whenever you like. That was the cue. Brock turned and bit Brog on the tail so hard that the blood started. Brog, surprised and enraged, spun around and bit Brock on the nose.
There was a shocked silence. Every scientist leaned backward, body pressed and hard against his or her chair back. Every eye was on the two of them. I don't know what got into me, Brock said. I've been feeling very weird. The scientist continued to stare. I was checking the historical records.
All of the scientists fled the room. Someone ran to a computer terminal. When Brock offered to take Brog out of the dome and let her loose in the mountains, no one argued. Neither did they say, hurry back, or even take care. No one came close as he loaded his pouch with water and food pellets. The customs gate monitor asked no questions. Out of sight of the dome, Brock was delirious with joy, jumping and running about in circles around Brock's boots. Why wasn't the atmosphere choking Brog if it was as poisonous as the dome dwellers claimed?
His heart beating rapidly, Brock unscrewed his helmet just enough to let a little air of the outside atmosphere. Nothing happened. In fact, he seemed to be breathing perfectly normal. He took off the helmet entirely. He was still breathing freely, but his heart was beating so hard he couldn't be sure. He waited for the choking sensation he had been warned of. It didn't occur. Could they be wrong? Could the outside world have healed itself? Perhaps the reason the scanner had so much trouble reading the outside atmosphere was because it wasn't within the range of the computerized expectations.
Could it be? Could it have been the fear that kept the dome dwellers prisoned many years longer than a poison environment would have? He unfastened the dry suit and slowly stepped out into the sunlight. It was wonderful how much faster he could walk without the clumsy suit. Who knows, Brock said to a frisky Brog. Who knows, maybe you're not the last dog. Your melon had to come from somewhere. Brog barked happily in reply. And maybe, just maybe, where there are dogs, there are humans as well. They stopped at the brook where they met, and both of them had a long drink.
Brock had no longer carried a scanner, but he knew what he felt was excited. The water was delicious.